And now B. Pickering, also from the University of Melbourne, is going to speak to fuel responses or different fuel responses to fire regimes in heathy woodlands. Thanks, B.
Thank you. You'll just have to excuse my scratchy voice. I woke up with sounding like kind of a 15-year-old boy starting to go through changes. So my name is B. Pickering, and I'm going to talk about fuel responses to different fire regimes in heathy woodlands, and just acknowledging that I've done a lot of this work with Jane, who you just heard from, and Chris Medlin from DECA, who led a lot of the field work in this study. And I just want to acknowledge that much of the field work was undertaken on traditional owner lands, and we want to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So we've got our image of heathy woodlands here. We've got three different, all classes heathy woodlands, but kind of varying a little bit in how they look. But in general, heathy woodlands have a canopy overstory of eucalypts that are about 10 to 15 metres tall. They have understories of medium and small shrubs that are over a ground layer of grasses, graminoids, or brackens. Heathy woodlands are quite widespread. They have a really high biodiversity value, and they burn intensely under mild conditions. So there's a lot of interest in kind of managing fire in these landscapes. Many of the understory and canopy species are fire tolerant, which means that they're able to resprout after fire, which means that they can survive most fires, and they're not dependent on seed for next generation establishment, which makes them really, really resilient to fire. And the minimum return interval of fires in heathy woodlands is around 10 to 12 years. And when we think about fuel recovery after fire, what we're really talking about is how the vegetation is regrowing. So our near surface fuels are the leaf litter and the twigs that are dead and lying on the ground. We've got near surface fuels, which is live vegetation that is pretty much in contact with the ground, like grasses and herbs. We have our elevated fuels, which are the understory shrubs that sit above that near surface fuel. And then we have our bark fuels, which are on our trees. And the reason why we think, does this work? Great. The reason why we think about the vegetation in terms of fuel layer is because it helps us think about fire behaviour. So for instance, when we think about fire forward rates of spread, the surface, near surface and elevated fuels are really influential on those. Our elevated fuels are most influential on flame heights, and our bark fuels are really influential on the laddering of fire into the canopy and spotting. So when fire moves through this landscape, whether it's a planned burn or a wildfire, it removes much of these fuels, and then with time, this fuel begins to regrow. And generally, we think of fuel recovery in terms of time since fire. And this Olsen curve is a really common way we think about it. After fire, fuel starts to recover and then it plateaus. But more recent evidence kind of shows us that fuel might not recover in this way. It could look something more like this. Additionally, the type of fire the vegetation experiences could influence how this fuel recovery trajectory. So for instance, if a vegetation experiences a low severity fire, which means only the understory is burnt, the fuel might recover very differently compared to if it was impacted by a high severity fire, where the fire is either scorching or completely burning the canopy. And again, this trajectory might change if the vegetation is impacted by fire again and again and again in a really short time frame. So this research was really trying to understand how time, severity, and frequency was impacting fuel properties and fuel hazard in the woodland heath. Fuel hazard being kind of a combination between vegetation structure and availability to burn. So to do this, we got Chris Medlin to lead the field campaign to go to 81 woodland heath sites across southwestern Victoria. We made sure that our sites covered a range of time since fires, so between 0 to 25 years. Fire severity, we made sure the sites had their most recent fire was split between low severity or high severity fires. And we counted how frequent those sites experienced fires since 1990. So some sites having only one fire, or some sites being burnt up to 3 times in the last 35 years. So then we measured fuel by using the extended method for the overall fuel hazard guide. So for those not familiar with the overall fuel hazard guide, it's this little guide down here. You basically take it out into the field and use pictures and descriptions to kind of make a rapid assessment of what fuel hazard is in the landscape. And the extended method for assessing fuel hazard is a method that Jane and I developed, which literally extends upon the overall fuel hazard guide, in that we just measure a few more fuel properties, and we also make measurements across a site more systematic. So this is an example of one of our plot layouts. We've got 250 by 50 metre transects outlining the plot, and then we've got quadrants every 4 metres all along these transects, which we make our fuel measurements. For bark fuels, we do assessments across the plot. We look at bark availability, we do stem counts, we look at diameter at breast height of the trees. We also, cool. For surface, near surface and elevated fuels, those assessments happen along these quadrants. And this is kind of a little depiction of it. We have a 1 metre quadrant around this height pole, and assessors will use the height pole to help look at surface depth and cover, and near surface and elevated top heights and cover. And then we average that for the whole site to give us good information about those fuel structure and fuel properties. So from these 81 sites, we've got all our fuel information, we've got our kind of fire information, then we plug it in and do some not so fancy analysis to give us some feedback and information about what's happening in these heathy woodlands. So in terms of surface fuels, we found that time since fire severity and frequency had no significant impact, which I was, a little bit floored by. We found that in general, the litter layer just remained about 8 to 12 metres deep, regardless of time. It remained around about 60% of cover, and the surface fuels primarily stayed between a low to a moderate hazard. Then we move on to the near surface fuels, and we found that severity impacted significantly on height, and that time since fire impacted significantly on hazard, but nothing else. So near surface fuel cover remained about 40%. From time 0 to time 25, regardless of severity and fire frequency. The near surface height on average was about 55 centimetres high. However, sites that experienced low severity fires had slightly shorter near surface fuels than sites that experienced high severity fires. The hazard, right after fire or a few years after fire, were a high, and that it increased linearly to become very high after 25 years after fire. For our elevated fuels, time since fire impacted fuel height significantly in cover, but only frequency impacted height as well. So immediately after fire, we found that our elevated fuels had about 2% of cover, and then as time moved on, they kind of transitioned towards having 10% of cover. And although not statistically significant, we did notice that in the sites that had more frequent fires, cover actually declined. So those that experienced 3 fires, there was a less elevated covers than those that experienced 1 or had no fire. Because 10% is pretty low cover for elevated fuel, our hazard remained between a low and a moderate. And our elevated fuels were on average about 1.6 metres high. However, as time moves on after a fire, our elevated fuels increase by about 10 centimetres. And if a site experienced multiple fires, our elevated fuels lost about 0.5 metre in height. In terms of bark, only time since fire impacted hazard. Stems per hectare remained at about 350 stems on average across all our sites, regardless of fire, time since fire severity and frequency. And again, although not statistically significant, we did notice that sites that experienced 3 fires had about 100 stems less per hectare than sites that only experienced 1 or 2 fires. So there is something going on there, but it just wasn't statistically significant. Immediately after fire, our bark hazards were moderate, and then as time progressed, that rose to a very high. So just a little summary on the project. We didn't see time impact our fuel like that Olsen curve that we saw at the start. It either didn't have an effect at all, and we have this kind of linear line of time since fire with our fuel properties, or we saw a linear increase instead of that Olsen curve shape. Severity only impacted significantly 1 out of 11 of our fuel properties. And although frequency also only impacted significantly 1 out of our 11 fuel properties, we saw that multiple fires were actually having some kind of impact on the fuels. So all in all, our heathy woodlands are really resistant to fire regimes in terms of fuel and fuel structure, but there are further questions. It doesn't really tell us anything about species composition and fauna, so there's a lot of thinking that needs to happen around there. We definitely need to look at what happens when we have more frequent fires, especially within short time frames. 3 fires in 35 years is still that average of a fire every 10 years. So what happens if we have more frequent fires at shorter intervals? And also we need to think about the interaction of severity and frequency. So what happens if we had repeated low severity fires compared to repeated high severity fires? That's it. Thank you.
Any questions for B?